Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast with me, Gary McGowan. I'm the co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell, here in tropical Costa del Kerry. How are things with you, Paddy? How is all in the capital?
It's positively fantastic, but if you ever say "Es capital" again,
That's capital.
you're getting the bullet. All our viewers may be aware that we're on a different medium here now because Zoom has just fucked us. Literally doesn't care. It goes, "Oh yeah, you normally record your podcast on Zoom. Yeah, we're not going to work. We're going to just turn off, not function." So we're here on secondary method, but that's all irrelevant because we're going to get stuck into the topic. And the topic today is what, Gary?
Blood pressure. The basics of blood pressure. So basically, the reason we wanted to discuss this is because blood pressure is one of those things that a lot of people will hear in conversations related to their health. Whether you've been to your doctor, it's probably one of the first things that they'll kind of screen you for. It's something you'll have heard in relation to nutrition probably, and something you may have heard in relation to training. And even in kind of more common everyday conversations, the topic of blood pressure comes up a lot. You know, when you hear someone say, "Oh, I'm stressed, my blood pressure was through the roof," or you see someone that looks real red and you're like, "Oh, that guy's blood pressure's through the roof." Those types of things, you may have heard them said, but you may not necessarily understand exactly what blood pressure is, why it's actually an important thing to understand, and what the kind of normal ranges are. You know, I think that's kind of an important thing to understand, how it's regulated, how exercise and nutrition affects blood pressure. And they are all things that we'll be touching on in this episode and in subsequent episodes to come.
Yeah, and I should just point out at this stage that this is part of our, we'll call it our cardiovascular series that we're running at the moment. So if you haven't already, I do recommend going back and listening to the previous 2 episodes on the heart that we did. And this is because a lot of this stuff, it mingles together. It's not like you can just target very specifically one system and then not have effects in another system. Like, again, that's not how the body works as a whole. Like, something that happens in one system generally tends to affect other systems. And if we're talking about a system itself, the cardiovascular system, then obviously trying to impact one section of it, i.e., you know, the heart adaptations, which we talked about previously, that does tend to affect other things in the system overall, right? So definitely go back and watch or listen to those episodes if you have not already, and because there's some things that are discussed in this episode and the subsequent episodes that, you know, you kind of need the background knowledge for. Anyway, Gary, blood pressure, we touched on it before, but what is it? How is it, you know, like, why is it important? How is it regulated? Give us a brief rundown.
Yeah, so like, first things first, I think it's important to just understand like what actually is blood pressure, like you said. And very simply thinking about it, we're basically talking about the pressure that is going to be exerted on the walls of your blood vessels when your heart is beating. It's not just when your heart is beating, but that's we typically talk about blood pressure with reference to the heart itself. Okay, so the reason that's important is because, as we have discussed in previous episodes, is that the systolic phase, okay, of the cardiac cycle, that's when your heart is ejecting. So that's when it's pumping out blood. The diastolic phase is the filling phase, when your heart is filling up with blood. That's the real simple way we can think of this. Go back to previous episodes if you're not familiar with that terminology, okay? So then when you think about a blood pressure measurement, what we're actually typically looking at is one number over the other. Systolic being the top number, that's basically the pressure within the vascular system, within your blood vessels, when the heart is ejecting. And then you've got your diastolic blood pressure, the bottom number, which is the pressure within those vessels when the heart is filling. Okay, so that's why that's typically lower, because the ejection, the contraction, is what increases the blood pressure and makes the top number greater than the bottom number. If that top number was not greater than the bottom number, you'd be in a bit of a bad situation, because blood flow would basically have stopped or be moving in the wrong direction. Okay, so when we talk about blood pressure, like, the first kind of start basic understanding, like the most fundamental thing, is just, right, this is just kind of the pressure within the blood vessels, right? That's the real simple way of understanding it. But you can kind of get a little bit more technical on it, and it helps you to understand subsequent things that we will discuss and how this relates to the heart beating, etc. Okay, so blood pressure, like typically, if you're going to look at a kind of a simple way of explaining it or describing it, it's cardiac output multiplied by total peripheral resistance. So they're the two things that are primarily affecting a blood pressure reading. Okay, so cardiac output is something that we discussed in the previous episode, and that's effectively the amount of blood that is pumping around your body, typically described in a given minute. Okay, so that's typically calculated as heart rate multiplied by stroke volume, with stroke volume being the amount of blood pumped out per beat. So you don't have to remember all that. All you need to know is that cardiac output is the amount of blood that's being pumped around the body. So in instances where you have an increase in cardiac output, such as during exercise, if that was to take place without a change in total peripheral resistance, the second part of that equation, you would have an increase in blood pressure. Okay, so more blood within the system, more blood trying to flow through, you get an increase in the pressure. And that's kind of intuitive. If you think of you're using a garden hose, you turn up the amount of water that's coming out, that's going through a fixed vessel, a fixed hose. The flow begins to increase. Usually there's more pressure on the walls of that hose. So that's kind of the cardiac output side of things. So as I said, that increases during exercise. I said if total peripheral resistance didn't change, blood pressure would begin to hugely increase. But during exercise, what's interesting is that the total peripheral resistance, which is effectively the resistance against which the heart has to pump the blood, that actually typically decreases in something like aerobic exercise. So when you're beginning to do something like aerobic exercise, the resistance in the blood vessels actually decreases because you get vasodilation, so you get widening of your blood vessels. And as a result, we don't see that massive increase in blood pressure that we might expect if we were to just look at the cardiac output side of things. So I think exercise is an interesting lens through which you can understand blood pressure, because it helps you to see that there's the cardiac output side of things, the amount of blood that's being pumped around the body, but there's also the resistance side of the equation. So that can kind of help you to understand some of the variables that then might start to affect someone's blood pressure reading. Because, for example, if you start to have some sort of stimulants, some stimulants can actually increase total peripheral resistance. They can cause your blood vessels to contract. But what can also happen then is that they also increase your heart rate, which increases cardiac output, and hence you see those increases in blood pressure. Okay, so that's how this kind of starts to play into things. But before getting to that sort of stuff, I think the thing that you need to understand is that, like, why do we actually care about blood pressure in the first place? Okay.
Before you go on to that, right? So I just want to get this clear for my stupid monkey brain, right? So we've got cardiac output, and we've got, generally I see it described as like systemic vascular resistance and arterial stiffness, right? And arterial stiffness, because again, like, you have to, if we're going to be talking about nutrition later on, we do have to make sure that that is, a point, right? But I just want to, like, I really like, well, my stupid brain, when I think of it, I do actually use that kind of garden hose type analogy, right? Because if you were to just keep increasing, and again, this is why it is quite illuminating to think of this through the lens of exercise, because it shows you just how much or how adaptable the body is, right? Because if you think of it just purely in terms of that garden hose scenario, right? If you just increase the cardiac output, right, you got your garden hose, like, there's a certain pressure. If your garden hose, would just say, is unbreakable, you can't, like, nothing's going to fall apart, the nozzle isn't going to shoot off, or the hole isn't going to burst or anything, right? If you were to pump water through that as much as possible, so that's the cardiac output side of things, right? So you're pumping water through that. If you were to do that, that hose, which is normally, bent all over itself, weaving around, if you put more cardiac output through it, the stiffness of that hose, like, it would become more stiff, right? Like, obviously, again, like, you put more water through it, like, it wants to go into like a straight line as much as possible, and be pressurized. If you could get it up to the stage where it was extremely pressurized, it could almost be like a complete solid. There's so much pressure built up there. Again, if it's unbreakable, right? But that's not really what happens with the body, right? Because you don't start getting an increase in cardiac output. Your heart isn't beating more, pumping blood around, and all of a sudden your body stiffens up and all your arteries and everything, like, that doesn't happen, right? So you kind of start thinking like, wait a second, like what's actually going on here, right? And that's the kind of stuff that once you start putting it in a different context or different analogy and start really realizing that this stuff, like it's not behaving like a normal pressure system would behave, then you start seeing all these other things start playing into it. And it actually makes it so much easier to understand when you just, again, detach for that second and kind of go, let me just put this in the garden hose setting and let me see what's going on. What would happen in a real world, like garden hose setting, and then what's actually happening in the body. And then if there's a discrepancy between those two, why is that?
Yeah, like that is an important kind of distinction, because if you think this solely in terms of like a mechanical system, it doesn't necessarily explain everything, because it is a biological system we're dealing with, and fundamentally in the body, when we do get these increases in flow, we have different regulatory mechanisms that allow us to kind of maintain pressure and make sure that things don't go awry. As you said, you can have cases where when blood pressure is quite high, you can get aneurysms in different arteries, so that's when the system begins to break down, where you do actually get that swelling of arteries, and that can be quite a problem if they're in the brain or in the aorta. They can be problems for sure. But normally, in normal healthy individuals with normal connective tissue in their vasculature and stuff like that, and they're in good health, what we typically see is that those changes in flow that you get, as if you're turning up the hose, the stress and the pressure, so the force of the blood pushing out on the vessel wall, and also the force of the blood rubbing against the vessel wall, both of those forces tend to lead to what's basically you could call stress-induced relaxation. So you get relaxation of the endothelium, basically those cells that line those vessels, because it's not just like these are tubes, inert tubes. This is a living system. These vessels are covered with live cells that are responsive to forces. So just like your muscles respond to force by adapting, so too do your blood vessels. So acutely, if we were to increase flow and we get all those forces acting on your blood vessels, different mediators within that system will allow for dilation. So we get widening so that things basically don't go awry, like you said. So within the body, like we've got kind of short and long-term mechanisms of regulating that. That within vascular regulation can occur purely due to the force. But what we've also got kind of regulating that system are things related to like total blood volume. So if you've got suddenly this huge increase in flow, your kidneys will actually begin to sense that change in flow, the change in volume, the change in osmolarity, or the composition of different ions and salts and stuff like that are hitting the kidney. And basically your kidney has different cells that are able to basically sense that. They sense those changes, and that activates a system or an axis that we call the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis. Okay, and that's part of this. The kidney also has other mechanisms of regulation, but ultimately that's one of the things that you'll hear come up a lot of the time when we talk about regulation, because basically what that system or axis is designed to do is to sense what sort of changes in blood volume and salt composition essentially are coming to the kidney, then release mediators that allow for sodium retention, or vice versa, to stop those mediators being released and stop that occurring. Basically, if our blood pressure is going up or down. Okay, so if you suddenly have a rapid drop in blood pressure, you'll get an increase in the mediators that are allowing us to retain more water and salt. So to effectively help maintain your blood volume, maintain your blood pressure. And when those systems are no longer effective, that's when you start to see elderly people have instances of things like orthostatic hypotension. So that's basically when someone gets up out of bed in the morning. We all experience this at times. You get up out of the bed in the morning, or you get up off a chair, and suddenly you feel real dizzy. And the reason for that is effectively because once you stand up, your blood pressure basically just drops, and you get a decrease in the perfusion of your brain. And you've got these receptors within your carotid arteries. You've also got them in your aortic arch. So in different blood vessels around the body, you've got receptors that basically respond to that drop in blood pressure. And basically what we get then is an immediate increase in the sympathetic nervous system activity, so your kind of stress response, and you'll also get an increase in the activity of those regulation mechanisms in the kidney. So basically what we're saying here is, like this is a really complex system. There's so many things regulating it, from the individual tiny little cells in the vessel wall to different mechanisms in the kidney to mechanisms in the brain. And all of this in a normal context is helping us to maintain our blood pressure despite these kind of perturbations that are experienced when we're getting up out of bed. It decreases when we're sleeping, it increases when we're exercising, it increases when we're stressed. So lots and lots of different things going on in a normal, healthy individual. So it's not just a static thing for sure.
Yeah, and one of those things that I always kind of, again, I said it in the cardio episode, the previous one we did, where you need to think of blood like not like a static thing. Like it's not just like, oh, it's red blood cells. Like blood does contain quite a lot of stuff, and then it also contains it in varying concentrations. So again, like sometimes you can have more of a certain solute, like salt or something, and you can also have less liquid, if that makes sense, like less water in your blood. So this is how you start seeing, again, we're going to go into it in the next episode, but how you start seeing how certain dietary things or training methodologies or whatever it is, how they start playing into the system. Because if you're like, okay, this system is influenced by what's in your blood, it's sensing what's in your blood, the salt concentrations and stuff in your blood, and you're like, okay, so maybe what I eat salt-wise plays a role in it. Now, it's a little bit more complex, as you'll see as we get into it, but this is the kind of stuff that you have to be thinking when you're listening to stuff like this or reading stuff like this, because it is very easy to kind of go, yes, blood pressure, just read through it and not put two and two together. But, you need to be looking at this from the perspective, or listening to this or whatever, from the perspective of, okay, they said blood influences this. They said the kidneys. What am I doing? What does the kidney actually do? What influences the amount of salt in my blood? Like you need to be thinking, like making those connections in your head now. Or like, for example, we said earlier on, we're like arterial stiffness or, systemic vascular resistance and stuff like that. You can be like, okay, well, I heard blood pressure goes up when you do something like a leg press, or maybe something like an overhead press. And you have to be thinking in your head, being like, why would that be the case? And obviously we're going to cover more of this stuff in a further episode, but I want you to keep yourself engaged when you're listening to this, in terms of like actually asking yourself questions and kind of going, I thought I understood blood. I thought I understood blood pressure, but there seems to be a little bit more to it, right? And you will see as we go through this that it's not all as it seems straight off the bat, like because this stuff has short-term and long-term, regulation, something that potentially raises your blood pressure transiently could reduce it chronically, right? And you can kind of get lost when you look at stuff in the short term, but don't actually put it in the context of your entire life. And again, especially if you don't put it in the context of like, this is what humans were designed to do. Like, we're designed to experience these changes in blood pressure. We're designed to experience increases in blood pressure, drops in blood pressure, and your system actually requires it. Like, it's a requirement that your body exercises, and by exercising, you change your blood pressure. So don't think of this in terms of like, oh, high blood pressure is always bad, right? Because you can have high blood pressure very transiently, and it's helping you, complete a lift or something. So I want you to keep the framework of this in terms of, let me put this in context. What's actually happening in the body short term, chronically, but also how is that influenced by other things that I can actually manipulate? And again, we'll get into that in a further episode.
100%. And to just kind of clarify exactly, what sort of things could change the resistance component, I think that's worth doing, just because I think the cardiac output stuff, it's kind of more intuitive. It's like, all right, we got more stuff, we got more blood flowing through a hose, like, cool. But like, what can actually affect this resistance component is something that's quite useful to understand. So a kind of applied example, which we'll touch further in the exercise episode, and we kind of mentioned in one of the other episodes. But when you're resistance training, I think this is actually a really easy way to understand how resistance can be increased within the system. Because when you're resistance training, particularly if you're using a Valsalva maneuver, that's basically where you take in a big deep breath and you hold it tight, you increase your intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure. You basically increase the pressure of everything within your trunk. You're also contracting all the muscles in your body, like, for example, if you're doing a deadlift. So as a result, your blood vessels are being compressed by the pressure that you've inhaled, but also that in the arteries within your muscles are basically compressing your vessels, along with all the water in that region, the interstitial fluids, the body fat, etc. So basically, when you're contracting everything, everything is contracting in upon those blood vessels. So as a result, much like when we lift weights in the gym, and your biceps are under more resistance because you added more load, your blood vessels are essentially also under more load in that case. They want to be compressed. They want to just kind of flatten. So as a result, if your heart is going to overcome that, what it needs to do is beat much, much harder. It needs to beat super strong and create a lot of pressure to overcome that resistance so that flow can be maintained to the tips of your fingers or the tips of your toes or your calf muscles that you're working or your biceps or whatever. So as a result, that's one means of increasing resistance, and as a result, blood pressure will be massively increased during resistance training acutely. So during a given rep that you do. So that's one way of understanding. Okay, that's resistance. But how about in other settings? So in other
Just
settings,
before you go on to that, just this is also like this also helps you visualize how like adaptations occur over time. Because if you put your heart into a baby, right, they wouldn't have the vascular system that was built enough to deal with the amount of blood that heart could pump out, right? And this is actually an issue they have with translating. If you're familiar with the research on like organoids, and they're trying to make mini kidneys, hearts, and different stuff, like that's what we did a lot of, or I learned a lot about that in my final year of college and stuff. But like trying to translate from this effectively organoid that you've made in a lab, right, from whatever induced pluripotent stem cells or whatever, and trying to translate that into an actual organ that you could transplant into an individual. Like, it doesn't have the vascular resistance. Like, yeah, okay, I can grow it to a certain size, and maybe that size is enough that I can transplant it and then have it grow in your body. However, your vascular system has had your whole life to adapt to the pressures that your heart is able to pump out, right? If I just put it in an organ that has never, had to adapt to those pressures, it's just going to explode, right? So this is one of those things where you have to realize that what you have done previously impacts what you are able to do now. Like, adaptations happen over time, and it is these short-term, what seemingly transient effects, like this rise in blood pressure you get from exercising, that's something that drives adaptations long term, so that you're actually better able to deal with changes in blood pressure overall. And again, this is something that people just genuinely forget, because it's kind of hard to think back to when you were a child, the first time you ever ran or did exercise in a meaningful way. You weren't thinking of like, oh Jesus, like my heart, my vascular system, it's adapting. Like, you obviously were just playing football or whatever, but the adaptations happen over time, and you have to keep that in mind. So you can't just look at this in terms of a snapshot.
Yeah, no, and that is so important. Just keep remembering, like, that this is a living system, and just don't think of your blood and your blood vessels as being like just this liquid within a pipe, because that's really just not the case. And it sort of ties in with what I was about to say next in terms of the blood vessel adaptations that do happen over time. So obviously, not all blood adaptations are beneficial, and other ways that can potentially, or other mechanisms through which your resistance can be increased, can be pathological or normal adaptations over time. So when we age, it's pretty normal that blood vessels begin to lose their compliance. Okay, so they begin to change in terms of their structure, in terms of the connective tissue structure, and that can lead to an increase in resistance, which is one of the reasons why blood pressure tends to increase as we age, and rates of high blood pressure are higher as you get into your 50s and 60s and 70s. So that's one thing, just age-related changes. Another thing many people will probably be familiar with, and you hear it talked about all the time, is atherosclerosis, or just plaques building up in the arteries. Okay, so as your arteries begin to build up these plaques, if you think about what kind of effect that's going to have, if you've got something that's bulging out of the side of an artery, that again is further resistance. So those changes associated with atherosclerosis, that's a means of increasing the resistance within an artery, and that's particularly the case as that begins to advance. If you've got 75% occlusion of an artery, that's one mechanism through which blood pressure can be increased, because you've basically got this increase in resistance. You've got other things like elevated sympathetic nervous system activity. Like that's something most of us are familiar with. You know, if you're super stressed, your sympathetic nervous system, your stress response, it's firing, and that can lead to constriction of your blood vessels. There's some different effects throughout the body, and it depends on whether you're exercising or not, but that can lead to constriction of the arteries. And because they're, again, living vessels, they're not just one, there's not just one circumference all the time that is responding all the time to nervous system inputs. And then of course you can have different things like more specific things, like you can have aortic stenosis. That's basically just when you've got stenosis is just narrowing. So you can have narrowing of the actual valves within your aorta, that big old blood vessel to which your left ventricle is pumping. So you can have things like that. And some of these things are genetic and can be inherited and can be affected by past diseases and stuff like that. So I think it's also important not to lose that when we're talking about blood pressure. There are significant genetic influences, whether it be at the level of, you know, different cells within the kidney, or the hormones that are in that RAS axis that we discussed, whether it be your blood vessel composition, whether it be having two valves instead of one in some of your arteries. All these things are super important, just to keep in mind before you focus solely on lifestyle, you know.
100%, Gary.
Yeah, so that's kind of the basics of like introductory concepts to, right, what is blood pressure. You should hopefully understand, have a vague idea of like, right, what is blood pressure, what types of things are influencing it, and like, you know, the thing to actually ask then is, why do you care? You know, why do you even care? Obviously, high blood pressure is probably the thing that tends to get more discussion, and rightfully so, right? It is one of those things where low blood pressure can kill you in seconds, and high blood pressure is more of a chronic thing that will kill you. But low blood pressure is typically something that, you know, you kind of know if it's a big problem, okay, because you might have had, you know, very significant fainting episodes, or if it's actually associated with like a medical condition in the hospital and your blood pressure suddenly drops. They're things that are like dealt with like real acutely, like they're medical conditions. And more or less, that's something that, you know, if you're suffering from severe blood pressure or severely low blood pressure, hypotension, you're fainting, you know, you're having really bad effects associated with that, that's something to just go to your doctor and discuss. You know, there's not really.
Yeah. Just on that, I was actually talking about this with one of my clients over the weekend, because he was saying, you know, when he's like relaxing in the sun and stuff, and then he just stands up really quickly, he does get like a very, you know, very serious, like he's like, oh, I can't really see, and, you know, he feels lightheaded and stuff. And like, obviously, like, you don't really need to go to your doctor for that, right? Like that happens to all of us, especially if you do go from that kind of lying down, relaxed position, and then you jump into like standing up or whatever. And I was just telling him that one of my friends actually has like very acute drops in his blood pressure, and he'll be doing something like, he'll be like relaxed on the sofa downstairs, maybe even playing FIFA or something. He'll just be relaxed, maybe watching a movie, and then he'll be like, oh, I need to go to the toilet, and he'll stand up and he'll make it to the toilet, which is just under the stairs, but then he'll just pass out. So he ends up like pissing on himself, right? Which is quite funny to slag him about, but it's also quite serious, because obviously he could, you know, faint and knock himself out and, I don't know, chip his teeth or fucking whatever off the toilet bowl, which would also be kind of funny, but at the same time quite serious. But obviously, like in that case, like he's been to the doctor and stuff. It's just, he's just really super fit, and he has been his whole life, and just gets these, like, he basically knows that if he stands up really quick from being relaxed, he's going to get it. So he has to like sit up before he just stands up, you know. But obviously, like that kind of stuff, it's kind of funny, but also it's quite serious, you know. Like what like he could easily do that in the context of, I don't know, he's sitting in the car or something, and acutely it just drops, he just fucking passes out at the wheel, you know. Obviously that's not the exact same situation, but obviously stuff like that can happen. And obviously, again, he could fall, bang his head off something, and just be dead or brain dead, you know, for the rest of his life, you know. So it is important. However, like you were saying, that high blood pressure side of things does tend to get a little bit more airtime, because it probably does affect more people, and also it's a little bit more dramatic in its effect, right? Because I always think of the high blood pressure issues that come about, like they are, we'll call them bigger issues. Like I can't say it's a bigger issue than potential death, but like you could have a stroke or something, you know, and obviously the people around you could see that due to an aneurysm because of high blood pressure, like chronic high blood pressure. Like I always think of the high blood pressure things. It's as if you're in a submarine, right? And there's this blood pressure outside, this high blood pressure outside. Like the submarine is under a lot of stress. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine if you're in a submarine and one of the rivets or the bolts just shot open, and all of a sudden that submarine is pumping full of water, right? So that's quite an issue, you know? Whereas if you're like, oh yeah, we're in the system where there's low pressure outside, you know, if something happens, like the submarine rivet pops or whatever, the water is going to come in nice and slowly. You know, it's not as dramatic. It's not a seemingly as big of an issue, you know? So yeah, that's just my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, like the reason we want to focus more on high blood pressure, like because low blood pressure screams at you. You know what? As you just said, like when someone has like quite low blood pressure, like they kind of tend to identify it by, you know, having those symptoms, whereas high blood pressure is more of a silent killer. You know, sometimes, to be fair, in the elderly, when people are, you know, if someone is prone to falls, they mightn't necessarily put 2 and 2 together and realize that it could be, you know, hypertensive episodes that they're having. But I think in general, high blood pressure probably warrants more discussion from our side of things in the health and fitness sphere. So
yeah, especially in the context that there's actually a lot more you can do nutritionally, lifestyle, training wise for high blood pressure. Like even if you're saying there, like blood pressure tends to change, like increase with age. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to offset that. Now, to what degree you can offset it, you know, it's up for debate. But there is a lot of stuff that you can do to offset that occurring, you know, and also there's a lot that you can do if you are afraid, like potentially there's high blood pressure in your family, you know, you're a male especially, and you know, oh, my dad, my granddad, my uncles, they all had high blood pressure, and you're kind of worried about it. There is stuff that you can do now to get ahead of it, but there's also stuff you can do if you have been diagnosed with high blood pressure, or you just, you know, use the blood pressure cuff yourself and you're like, oh, those numbers seem pretty high, you know. There is stuff you can do. However, with the low blood pressure stuff, there's not a huge amount that you can be like, you know, I'm actually just going to change my diet up. I'm just going to change my lifestyle up. It's like there's not a huge amount you can do for that.
Yes, sir. So high blood pressure, as I said, it's a bit of a silent killer, okay? Because high blood pressure isn't typically associated with any symptoms outside of like a hypertensive emergency. You know, you're not typically looking at the presence of any symptoms that you're going to be aware of. And as a result, a lot of people do go undiagnosed because people are just saying, you know, I feel fine, you know, why would I bother? And it can also present problems in terms of actually caring enough to try and change your lifestyle or try and change your treatments or adhere to treatments rather, because you're like, well, I feel fine, you know? And it is one of those things where we are focused more when discussing hypertension, that's a technical term for high blood pressure. We're focused a little bit more on a surrogate marker. Okay, so when you're treating like a disease that you have, you know, someone has some sort of disease, they're like, yeah, I have this disease. I'm treating this disease to make the effects worse. Whereas with high blood pressure, effectively what you're targeting is a surrogate marker for an event that's going to take place in the future. Okay, so when we say a surrogate marker, essentially what we're talking about is trying to change something that is in the causal way between our now and the occurrence of some sort of event in the future, such as heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, you know, damage to the eyes, things like that. They're all problems associated with hypertension long term. So basically, they're the things that we're trying to prevent. Ultimately, it's like it's heart attack and stroke that are the really big things that you're trying to stop, because they can kill you, you know, and if they don't kill you, they can significantly affect your quality of life thereafter. So fundamentally, like, you obviously care about your quality of life, but you also care about your quantity of life. And, you know, if you don't care about one of them, you probably care about the other one of them. So as a result, we have to think about, all right, how can we actually reduce the incidence of things that can reduce those things that we actually care about, okay? And blood pressure is a surrogate marker that lies in that causal pathway. So,
yeah, and just on that, like, I always look at like surrogate markers because it can be like a little bit esoteric when you think of it, but it's kind of akin to, you know, planting a load of flowers and consistently watering them in the
Yes.
hopes that you get more bees, or more birds or something, like you might have got the exact same amount of bees visiting your garden or birds visiting your garden if you didn't plant these, but you have a better chance of bees or birds visiting your garden if you do have a lot of nice watered plants. So the surrogate marker is watering and planting your plants, but the thing that you want to affect is downstream of that.
Yes, sir. And like you can kind of understand why people might be skeptical of surrogate markers sometimes, because it's like, oh, like why should I bother treating this thing? Like, because people aren't totally familiar with exactly how their position on the blood pressure spectrum might relate to risk of stroke or heart attack or whatever. And it's a bit harder to conceptualize, particularly when you don't have any symptoms. And like some surrogate markers are much better than others. Like blood pressure is quite a good one because it does satisfy essentially what you would want for a surrogate marker to be useful, because it does predict the events that you're going to have. So, we can say when we look at the research, we're like, right, people with higher blood pressure, as blood pressure increases, their risk of heart failure, heart attack, stroke, etc., does actually increase. So that's one of the variables. But also the other thing is like, all right, when we begin to treat or modify this surrogate marker, so blood pressure, so when you begin to reduce a person's blood pressure, does that actually reduce the number of events of heart failure, heart attack, stroke? Because you'd actually want that to happen for it to be useful. And that is the case. So in this case, when you look at blood pressure, you're like, okay, we know that it does predict these events. We know that by reducing it or targeting it, we can actually reduce the number of those events. So very clearly, it becomes something that's useful to then try and modify. So that's essentially where blood pressure sits. That's why you should probably care about it, because it is something that accumulates over time and can begin to cause significant problems in the long term. And it also does lie in somewhat in the causal pathway, the development of other diseases. It can lie in the various sort of cardiovascular diseases, various kidney diseases. It can play into and with and between kind of the relationship between diabetes and heart disease. So you have to understand that all these things do act together, and it's never just about thinking, okay, it's just this one thing. So,
and just on that, they can all seem like it's a quantity of life type deal, even though again, like having a stroke and being paralyzed is a quality of life thing. Sure. But the thing, and I'm only saying this purely because my friend listens to this and he loves when I say stuff like this. But it's also a quality of life thing in terms of everything that you can do to improve your blood pressure improves your sex life, right? Like you have to think of it, like I said in the last one, like boners and stuff, that's all influenced by all this blood, this cardiovascular stuff. So if you work on your blood pressure, you get better boners. You also generally tend to have better body composition, better health metrics in general. So it is not just a quantity of life thing, it is a quality of life thing. So that's my sell on, looking after your blood pressure. It's going to improve your sex life.
On a somewhat relevant note there as well, so when we talk about this hypertension, basically what we're always talking about is systemic hypertension. So within the systemic arterial system, but you do also have a pulmonary arterial system as well. And if you have pulmonary hypertension, so hypertension within the lungs, like the main treatment for that is sildenafil, aka Viagra. So I mean, there might be a bit of
this does bring it up into like stuff that you can do and stuff that you might not realize actually does influence into the system, in terms of like some people take like pre-workouts and stuff and they'll have like citrulline malate in them, and this is like a precursor for that whole arginine, nitrogen, nitrous oxide system, everything, and it's a vasodilator. And it's like, oh, why are you getting vasodilation? You're like, oh, for the pumps. And you're like, yeah, you realize that that's good for your blood pressure. And they're like, oh, unreal, so stuff like that. Or nitroglycerin is another one, which, just as a complete side note, just because this is the kind of stuff that I think about, especially in like the times that we're in and there's uncertainty and everything. But anyway, especially because Ireland is like a huge producer of like dairy products and everything. Well, one of the products like Glanbia make is glycerol, right? And they sell it as that bodybuilding glycerol. I can't even remember what it is.
Oh yeah,
whatever it is. Anyway, Hydromax. All right,
yeah.
that's what they sell it as, right? But they also pump well, I think it's ammonia that they pump. I'd have to look at the systems a little bit more, but they pump nitrogen into waterways as waste product. And obviously, again, you could think of that like there's a circular system here where they're getting nitrogen from fertilized fields that the cows eat, that the fertilized fields were fertilized by nitrogen bought from a German company, and then Glanbia get the milk products and put that nitrogen waste into the water when it could just be recycled. However, a more effective way that it could be recycled, in my personal opinion, is to make nitroglycerin. And you could go, oh, nitroglycerin, that's for your vasodilation. But I realistically just want Ireland to be one of the biggest arms dealers in the world by making nitroglycerin, which is another form of, TNT or explosives, So I would love to see Glanbia branch out. So if you're listening and you work for Glanbia or you know someone that does, if you think of all that wastewater that you put out, I think it's Wexford that they do it, and they have their cheese manufacturing down there. Any of that nitrogen that you're wasting, putting out into the sea, impacting all the mussels and everything. Everyone's environmental conscious, and they're like, oh, you can't do this. I'm telling you right now, there is profit to be made in making nitroglycerin, pretending to market it to the medical field as a vasodilator, which again, TNT is a vasodilator, which is kind of fucked up when you really start to think about stuff. Market it as a vasodilator, but really just stockpile TNT. Be fucking way better use of your time. But anyway, that's just a complete aside, and that'll just give you an insight into how my brain works.
Yeah, I heard it here first. So yeah, basically, in summary, blood pressure kind of acts as a surrogate marker. You should probably care about it if you don't want to die or reduce your quality of life in the long term. I think that's fair enough, which kind of brings us on to a very key thing, and that's like, all right, Gary, what the fuck should my blood pressure be? Okay. And this is actually more contentious than you might think, okay? Because it's been chopped and changed, and there's a US EU bit of a disagreement going on here. Fundamentally,
and just even without the disagreement, let's be honest, they also have the weirdest imperial weird units for it. It's like milligrams or millimeters of mercury above atmospheric pressure. So rather than doing something like, oh, let's use like an actual, SI unit like pascals or something like that. Let's not do that. Let's just use millimeters of mercury above atmospheric pressure. And it's like, why? So again, like these numbers that you're here, they are made up. Like they're actually not related to anything. Like in terms of the actual number itself, that the measurement, like obviously it is related to your blood pressure, and that is related to like what we're trying to influence. But yeah, like the whole system is fucked up.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. And I mean, like, so before we get the actual numbers, like think about like what are we actually measuring? Because I think that this helps you to kind of backtrack and like stick all the physiology and the numbers and the measurement together. It helps put it all together. So what we're fundamentally measuring is sound or lack thereof. So when you're the classic way of measuring blood pressure is, your doctor puts the cuff on your arm, they get their stethoscope, they pop it onto the brachial artery there, they pop it onto the front of your arm. And basically what's going to happen is they're going to increase the pressure in the cuff far beyond the level that's going to occlude blood flow, so stop flow in that artery.
So it's basically BF4 training, yes?
Exactly. So stop flow completely through that artery. Then what they're listening for is the resumption of what's called the Korotkov sounds, okay? So the first one that you hear is going to be your systolic blood pressure reading. And that's the sound that actually is flow through a vessel, okay? So it's not just the sound of like the heart muscle contracting, it's actually the first time that the blood can start to pump through again because the pressure is reduced, and you begin to hear the sound of turbulent flow. So that the start point for that is your systolic blood pressure reading. And like, I think it's important to understand like why that actually is the case. So like if you think back to our conversation about resistance, so when you put on that cuff, it increases the resistance, it's pushing all the muscle, the fat, the skin, etc. down against that vessel, it compresses it, and once your heart is strong enough, it basically hits its 1 RM, and if its 1 RM is 140, so it can actually push through at 140, that's your systolic blood pressure, 140 millimeters of mercury, because your heart was pushing through that much. Then the diastolic reading is essentially when those sounds disappear and that indicates that flow has resumed normally, so it's no longer turbulent. Okay, so it's no longer, and when I say turbulent, if you've ever been in a plane, you've experienced probably what's called turbulence, and that's when the plane is basically bouncing up and down, it's all over the place. And same thing kind of goes here when it comes to the flow of a liquid, the flow of blood in this case. Basically, the flow is real turbulent. It's all messy, it's all up and down, it's hitting off the walls.
It's like a stream with a load of rocks in it.
Exactly, rather than just flowing nice, smooth, laminar flow where all parts of that blood are moving at the same level. Okay, so that's essentially what we're measuring. And like ideally, like the typical kind of soundbite that you hear is like, right, blood pressure should be 120/80. That's kind of the level that you should be at, and that's pretty much true. Going below that can still be beneficial, and sometimes you'll hear 115/75 is kind of being the ideal level, and this is where you start to things start to get a bit less clear, because there's basically disagreement between the European Society of Cardiology and the American College of Cardiology on where exactly we begin to stage, what stage 1, what stage 2 hypertension. When do we tell someone they are hypertensive? What is pre-hypertension? When do we initiate treatment, etc. So like when you look at the American guidelines, basically you're going to be regarded as being hypertensive or having high blood pressure once you kind of surpass 130/80. So like that's basically just kind of high normal in Europe. So like you've kind of got some differentiations there. So if I was to go to my doctor here in Ireland, they might say, oh, your blood pressure, it's a little bit above normal, but it's fine, no need to initiate treatment. Whereas if you were in the US, they might say, okay, it's time to initiate treatment. For the purpose of this discussion, like that doesn't really matter. You're just trying to understand like where your blood pressure should roughly be. You're not going to be making treatment decisions. This isn't a medical podcast, but essentially once you begin to increase beyond 120/80, regardless of what you call it, your risk does begin to increase. But essentially, the benefits of lowering and the benefits, whether that be through lifestyle or drugs, and the benefits of administering more aggressive drug therapy, the benefits are going to basically increase the higher your blood pressure is. So you're going to get a better benefit. You can still benefit at lower levels, but it's just going to change the treatment decision. And the important thing to understand there is that, as I mentioned earlier, all of this is interacting with other variables. So whether or not your doctor decides that you need, treatment for blood pressure or what's going to be possible, that might depend on whether or not you're already exercising and you have your diet in order. Because, for example, if you're training 5 days a week, you've been eating a real healthful diet for 10 years, your body weight you're in good shape, normal BMI, waist circumference is normal, healthy body fat. If you got all that in check and your blood pressure is 150/100, then you don't have the same opportunity to adjust your lifestyle as someone who hasn't ticked any of those boxes already. So it's important to understand that, and also that if you've also got if you've got diabetes as well, if you've also got high cholesterol, you've got other risk factors for the development of these diseases downstream. You smoke, you drink a lot of alcohol. All of these things change your risk of developing cardiovascular disease, and hence they're going to change the decision with regards to treatment. And of course, that also varies with the level of blood pressure. If you're coming in with 165/105 as your blood pressure reading, your doctor mightn't just say, oh yeah, just change your diet a little bit, that should be fine. Like, it's unlikely that you're going to get, a massive drop that much, potentially in some cases, but overall, I think it's just worth understanding. We're not trying to make treatment decisions here, but worth understanding that all of those things can change the potential for you to reduce your blood pressure and the decision your doctor might make when you're working with them.
And it's also just completely the opposite way. If you are of the opinion, you're like, yeah, I know I'm carrying a little bit of excess weight, it's not something I'm too concerned about. I'm healthy, and you're measuring your blood pressure and it is quite high. Well, that is like, you're not doing any of the general healthy practices. You're not exercising. You're not looking after your diet. But you're like, yeah, it's fine. Like, yeah, I'm a little bit overweight, but I've been listening to this healthy at every size or any size movement, and it's fine. Like, they say that it's the patriarchy, and we shouldn't care about what our body looks like and any of that kind of stuff. And he was like, yeah, that's fine. Like, I actually couldn't care less if that's the belief you want to have. That's cool. However, like, this is a marker of health, and if you are overweight and this marker is elevated, and you're not doing any of the practices that you could do to bring this down, like, you're not actually engaging in healthful eating practices or lifestyle practices and getting this under control, well, you're not healthy at any size. Like, this is, again, a marker of health. Now, again, we can argue about the validity of the exact number of what is the actual marker of health, but it is something that is modifiable and we know correlates with better health, so just putting that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very easy to just kind of overlook these things, and not even for people in that school of thought, but also people who are they're into bodybuilding or they're into powerlifting and stuff.
They're walking up, boy.
Sometimes people are like, yeah, I know, my blood pressure is 150/100, but
and they're red as fuck.
It's just because I train, something like that. And it's like, yeah, well, long term, this mightn't be the best. You might want to think about that. So yeah, like, especially
if you are engaging in the use of performance enhancing steroids.
Yes.
But
yeah. So yeah,
all this stuff does get regulated. Again, if you think about it, it's the nervous system regulating, it's the endocrine system regulating. There's a lot of stuff that's going in between this. Anyway, I have nothing else to say. Gary, you look like you need to pee.
No, I'm good. I just want to finish by quickly touching on a couple of notes about measurement, because I think that's something that kind of does need to go in here. So basically, like, at this point in the conversation, what you should understand is, roughly what blood pressure is, some of the things that are regulating it, what we're actually measuring when we try to measure blood pressure, roughly where the ranges should be, and why you should actually care about blood pressure in the first place. Importantly, there are, of course, additional nuances that go into, like as I said, that disagreement between different guidelines and stuff like that. Like, there's lots of nuances that go into those things. We will discuss them in an article or articles that we'll be publishing on blood pressure, because obviously there's a lot more specifics that we'd like to get into. But for now, the final thing that I do want to touch on is basically blood pressure measurement, because some of us, like, I have a blood pressure monitor, you have a blood pressure monitor, some of our clients have blood pressure monitors. But it's really important to at least have some idea of how you actually go about measuring these things, because measurement error is a very significant problem when it comes to measuring blood pressure, whether it be the size of the cuff. So if you're really jacked, you might need your doctor to actually get a larger cuff for you. There's a guy in my class, he's quite a skinny guy, and he needed to use one of the smaller cuffs. So that's just how it goes, and children, they need to use smaller cuffs, obviously. So these types of things can affect the actual measurement. So that's the first thing to try and nail down. If you are measuring from home, at least check, is this the right cuff? Or if you're going to your doctor, especially if you're listening to this podcast and you're huge and jacked like me and Patty, like, you might need to say to your doctor, hey bro, hit me with the bigger cuff, man.
You got a rhinoceros cuff? Yeah, thanks.
Your little skinny arms, being there. But there you go. But other things on top of that, like that, if you do go to your doctor, what you might notice, if they might say to you, oh, your blood pressure is a bit high, but I want you to come back in 2 weeks. So that's an important one, is that if you're like, you don't just get a diagnosis of hypertension based on one blood pressure reading. Okay, so you need to have multiple measurements. That's quite important here. Generally, like, the way within a given context, within a given measurement, what you want to do is sit still for 5 minutes. Okay, ideally prior to measuring your blood pressure. You don't want to have had caffeine. You don't want to have just come from the gym. You don't want to be smoking alcohol. You basically want to be taking this in a context where you are already relaxed. Take 2 or 3 measurements. I think it's typically 3, maybe just 2 is fine. But basically, the one you're taking is the highest reading. Okay, so that might be kind of counterintuitive, because a lot of us are like, I'll take the lowest one, that's fine, or even take the average. But no, generally your doctor is going to be interested in taking the highest one. And then kind of thereafter, there are further steps before you just say, oh, I've got high blood pressure. So there's also things like ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. So typically someone, if your doctor suspects that you have high blood pressure, they'll give you a blood pressure monitor to wear at home for 24 hours. That includes during your sleep. And then they'll have a specific cutoff for what the average should be over that 24-hour period, because that's obviously giving you more insight rather than just this single measurement. Or it could be just a home blood pressure monitor that you take maybe a measurement every hour, just to see how blood pressure is varying throughout the day. So that all gives you more information, because there can be things that basically mask either a positive or negative diagnosis. So, many people have heard of the white coat effect or white coat hypertension, where when you go to your doctor, basically you're feeling a bit anxious, you're feeling a bit stressed, you don't like doctors, and as a result, your blood pressure is a little bit higher than it would normally be. So that's basically a false positive for the diagnosis of hypertension, because if they were just to say, oh, this person has high blood pressure, it could have just been that you were a bit stressed. But also, on the opposite side of things, you've also got what's called masked hypertension. So, you could be someone who, on average, your blood pressure is actually like 160 over 100. You've got signs of end organ damage. Your kidneys are destroyed. Your eyes, they're just in awful shape.
It's like when your eye exploded that time.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got all the signs that, like, all right, you've got hypertension. But when you go to the office, or the office, that's just an American thing to say, to the doctor, to the GP.
Doctor's office, yes.
Yeah, when you go to the GP, they basically say, oh yeah, it's 118 over 69. Absolutely beautiful. You're fine. Go out. Go ahead. So it can be a false negative or a false positive. So as a result,
especially if you're doing stuff, you're like, oh, I did like 10 minutes of meditation before I did this measurement because I wanted to impress my doctor. And like, people do stuff like that. They're like, I need to really bring it down. But it's not like, you're not trying to catch yourself out. You're trying to get an idea of your day-to-day blood pressure. That's why that ambulatory, if I'm saying that right, I always say that word wrong. Blood pressure monitor is like generally the gold standard, if you will, because it gives you a lot more information of not only how your blood pressure is at a given moment, but also how it is across the entire day. And as we said earlier on, like, your blood pressure does change at different points in the day. This also has to be taken into account when you are going to take a single measurement of your blood pressure. Like, if you take it in the morning, or you take it in the evening, or you take it at 3 a.m. when you woke in the middle of the night, like, these are all going to be different blood pressure readings. And again, you can trick yourself and be like, yeah, I actually noticed that my blood pressure is always lowest at 4 p.m. So I'm only going to ever take my blood pressure at 4 p.m. That's not what we want to see. I'd rather be like, all right, I want to take your blood pressure when it's at its fucking highest. And then we get a better idea of like what's actually going on.
Yeah. So measurement is an important thing. And I think one particularly important note to add in here is that, like, obviously we're speaking very often to personal trainers. Like, that's a very significant part of our audience. And, ultimately the purpose of trying to do podcasts like this and put out information like this is so that we can start to bridge that gap, between personal training and people who are in the gym every day, and the kind of, frontline, we could say personal trainers are the frontline, but, and going to your GP and being in the hospital, that kind of medicine side of things. Okay. And one thing to understand here is that sometimes personal trainers, they're trying to, show additional initiative, and they start to take their clients' blood pressure to try and get an idea of where it's at. But what often happens here is, when your client comes in on the first day to see you, a new client, you're taking their body fat and everything, they're shitting themselves. That's totally normal. They're so anxious, they're stressed. They've been talking to their friends about it all day. Well, I'm going to a new personal trainer. I've never gone to a personal trainer before. I'm real nervous about this first session. And oh God, I hate having my body fat taken. And you've just spent 10, 15 minutes pinching their thighs, pinching their stomach or whatever. And now you're going to take their blood pressure. It's really important to realize that there's going to be stress and anxiety playing into that reading. And that's especially the case with personal training, where someone is going to the gym. They might have been outside listening to Metallica for the last 15 minutes trying to get hyped up, or taking their favorite pre-workout, So if you are a personal trainer and you're trying to get your clients you're trying to get a measurement of your client's blood pressure, it could be worth, doing something like once a month, you actually have an open office hours for 4 hours where your clients have the opportunity to come in and just take their blood pressure, or whatever. You make that accessible to them, and then you try and replicate those circumstances that we discussed already. Because, like, I've seen people go on courses abroad, even where they've had their blood pressure taken, where blood pressure education has been provided, and in the middle, they're in the middle of a course where they've had 3 coffees. Everyone's watching them getting their blood pressure taken. They've only slept for 4 hours the night before, and they were on a flight, and they've got some edema that's increasing their blood pressure already because they've been flying. And in those contexts, everyone's like, "Oh shit, my blood pressure is so high," but again, not a reliable reading. So they're the types of things that you do need to keep in mind.
You also need to keep in mind that, especially if you are a listener outside of Ireland, where I think it's okay for you to measure your client's blood pressure. In some states in America, that's illegal. Like, it's not, I don't know if it's illegal, but it's not, like, it's not the role of a personal trainer. You're not allowed to do it, because I know we do have quite a lot of international listeners. Well, international for us, generally it's seen as international as outside of America, but we are in the mighty era. So international is outside of us.
International is outside of Kerry, man.
No, sir. The real world is outside of Kerry.
Hilarious. But yeah, guys, look, I think that's the vast majority of what we wanted to get through. Number one, because we covered everything, and number two, because my laptop's on 3%, and as Paddy said, I do look like I need to pee. So yeah, that basically the intent of this podcast was to cover the basics of blood pressure. So the different things that go into regulating it, the normal values, etc. Everything that we discussed. What we will do after this is record subsequent episodes on what actually affects blood pressure in terms of what's modifiable. So things such as exercise, nutrition, sleep, alcohol, smoking, etc. They're the types of things that we want to discuss, primarily exercise and nutrition, obviously, because then we can start to actually try and move the needle, and obviously none of this is medical advice. And as I said, it's really important to understand, particularly in our kind of sphere of the fitness industry, that like lifestyle isn't always enough. And that's why you do need to kind of work with a doctor if you are having problems with your health, because very often people can be resistant to that idea that medication might actually be beneficial in some contexts. But as I said, when we're looking at blood pressure as a surrogate marker, it's something that responds well to treatment, and the subsequent events that we don't want happening, like dying, do reduce in response to treatment. So it is something that, it is worth seeing your doctor about if you're having problems with it.
Yes, sir. I have nothing else to say except that everyone should sign up for the Coach's Corner, because you're interested in stuff like this and you're a personal trainer, or you coach individuals, or you're a nutritionist, or you want to understand any of this kind of stuff. This is where we're going to put our best information. So if you're like, oh, I'd love to see some case studies on how you would actually put all this stuff together, they'll be in the Coach's Corner, So if you're not on the wait list, because there's a wait list right now in terms of we haven't launched it yet. So there's literally no, you don't have to pay anything. You don't have to commit to anything. You literally just put your name down on a list, and we'll send you out information and a significant discount as soon as the Coach's Corner is going to launch, because we're probably going to do a bit of a pre-launch for the people that are on the list, and then all the plebs who don't sign up, they can get no discount, and they can get it at a later date. But we'll see how that goes. Other than that, I have nothing else to say. Join the Facebook community. Subscribe and all that fun stuff on YouTube. And join the email list. And do you have anything else to say, Gary?
It's too easy.
It literally is.